First of all, welcome everybody. And I'm glad to, well, I can't actually see you, but I sense that you are out there based on the numbers showing on my screen. So I think to get things started, first I'm going to introduce Jennifer Peters and let her make some welcoming remarks, and then we'll jump into our training. Jennifer?
Thank you, Les. Good morning, everyone. I am glad to have everyone in attendance today. I do welcome y'all. This will be our recertification class. We've decided to focus mainly on the new Section 3 rule because, as everyone knows, things have changed greatly, and we thought this would be greatly beneficial to everyone. But before we get started with that, I would like to remind everybody that I sent an email out on about May 12th concerning the new HUD rule on the environmental updates where you have to include climate change and the new environmental justice. So please, if you would, go back to that email and go to HUD's website and read the update changes, please, because it is important. And that will apply to everything CDBG and disaster recovery once we do that. And for those of you that deal with ARC, they have issued their decision on the Build American, Buy American Act. So that will went into effect for any new grant agreements, grant amendments, any additional funding requests that went in effect with them on May 14th. And at this time, I do not have guidance from HUD on how that's going to play into CDBG. So once that decision is made, we will issue the guidance on that. So if you want to read up on it, that is OMB M2211. So that will give you a little bit of guidance on how how the acronym BABA is going to play into our lives moving forward. That will affect FYI too, that will affect your SRF programs. So even if you just say you had CDBG and an ARC project and CDBG did not apply BABA to them, ARC will make it apply to the entire project. So that's just a heads up on some other new changes that is coming your way. So if you have any questions on those, y'all can just email me directly. If you would, that would be just at jennifer.peters@ky.gov. And if I can answer, I will. If not, we will dig in and try to find you an answer. So with that, I say welcome. I hope you enjoy your training today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Les.
Thanks, Jennifer. All right, so let's see if I can move slides. Yes, that works. All right. So I believe everyone should already have received, well, you obviously received the links since you were able to join. And so I think with that, there was the overheads. And I'm hoping that folks have gone ahead and printed those out. That may be a helpful way to take notes on this. This session is being recorded, and I believe it's going to be posted, so it would also be available for future reference on that. So we've divided this into 2 sessions. So we'll be going until noon today, and then we will regroup this afternoon from 2 to 4. And complete the balance of the materials on the new Section 3 rule. We also have tomorrow an office hour session from 10 to 11. You're not required to attend this, but the idea is that if we haven't been able to answer all of your questions, that we have some time set aside to be able to do that. Also, I think a lot of times we see that as folks go away, have a little time to think about this after a training is over, they oftentimes come up with some additional questions of, okay, how's that going to work? How do I apply this? What about something? And so we wanted you to have the opportunity to be able to come back the following day, short period of time to be able to ask questions, to be able to hear questions that other folks had and the answers to that. So with the email that came to you, I believe there are separate links for each of our sessions, the morning, the afternoon, and also the office hour session for tomorrow. With that, I wanted to just do a quick introduction here. So Andolyn, you want to tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Andolyn Nesbitt Rodriguez. I am have been in the community development industry for about 15 years. I worked with an entitlement community and with nonprofits, doing CDBG, home, environmental reviews, fair housing, and Section 3. And I am in Columbia, South Carolina. Well, very nice to be with you all.
Great. Thanks, Andolyn. And I would guess, I was thinking about this morning, I would guess since this is the, for folks that were previously certified, probably all of you have sat in a training with me in the past, so not much introduction needed, but I've been with ICF for 15 years now, been doing training with Kentucky and working on the handbook and other things for the last 15 years or so. And prior to that, I worked at the state level for 20 years. With that, oh, and I'll just mention that this afternoon, you're going to be meeting another ICF person, Carrie Kronberg, will be joining us for the afternoon session on this. All right, so we're going to be going through the new Section 3 rule, trying to understand, not only why we have a new Section 3 rule and the all the details of that, but then thinking about, okay, how is this going to impact your implementation of your local program, and try to anticipate some of those issues for that. So since we can't, we're not in a room together, we can't kind of go around and do introductions, I thought we would start out with a quick poll. So throughout this training, we're going to be doing polls or knowledge checks. They will pop up on your screen, and what we'll ask you to do is click on the answer that best matches for you, and then hit the submit button. And we're kind of going to use that as a way right now to get a feel for who the folks are that are in the room, but also as we go through later, just to try to make sure that folks are grasping some of those key concepts along the way. So if we can open up our first poll question. So first question, is this your first advanced training since you received your KCDBG certification? Yes or no? And then just click on the submit button. All right. So for a lot of folks, this is their first advanced training. So great, welcome. And then we've got a whole group that have been around for a while, and so they've had the benefit of a number of these advanced trainings. And for those of you wondering, the photo is at Pleasant Hill, Shaker Village, which is in Harrodsburg. All right, next poll question. How knowledgeable are you about the old Section 3 rule, the Part 135? Do you feel not knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, or very knowledgeable? All right, so looks like most folks feel somewhat knowledgeable about the old Section 3 rule, and we're gonna, to some extent, we're gonna be trying to help you unlearn some of what you knew from the old rule, but there are gonna be some things that I think will help you understand the new rule, but but there will be some differences as we go along. And then for our final poll question here, how knowledgeable are you at this point about the new Section 3 rule? And the same options here. All right, so looks like most folks don't feel knowledgeable about this, which is why we thought this training was probably needed. For some of you, you have kind of worked on digging into what was made available on HUD's website. There were some HUD trainings that were done on this, which you would have had Andalyn and myself and Carrie as trainers on that. So we want to make sure everybody gets the opportunity to be kind of walked through this so that you feel like you are at least somewhat knowledgeable, if not knowledgeable by the time we get to the end of this session. All right, so what we're trying to accomplish today is to walk you through the new Section 3 rule, the Part 75 rule, and we're going to go through the details on, how is this rule different than the old rule? What are all the definitions and basics on this? So at the end of this, we want to make sure that you feel pretty comfortable in what all the rules and requirements are, that you know how to qualify, since we're going to be tracking qualified workers that qualifies either Section 3 or targeted Section 3 workers, that you understand what those definitions are, what method you would use to be able to qualify them. We're going to talk a lot about Section 3 business concerns, and which could be sort of the easy streamlined version of this if you had Section 3 business concerns. And then we're going to do some practice on this, on not only working with the numbers on this, but kind of trying to think through those real world scenarios. And I'll just mention that, Andalyn and Carrie and I have had the opportunity of doing quite a lot of this training nationwide at this point, and listening to folks and their real world scenarios, and we've been working with Jennifer and the DLG team. So we're anxious to hear your questions and help you be able to apply them, because knowing what the regulation says obviously isn't enough for practitioners. You need to know, okay, how do I actually pull that one off? How do I run my program, get all of this done, and be in compliance with those regulations? So that's really our goal here. So we've kind of divided up the material. We're going to start out going through the rule itself and all those requirements. I think most of us as practitioners, at the same time, our mind is going to be going with those implementation questions. We may be asking you to hold some of those a little bit. We're going to start out with going through the details of the rule itself, and then getting into the planning and implementation, sort of the oversight while you're implementing this. And then we'll end with that reporting, the collecting of data that needs to be in place to be able to report back to HUD on this. And throughout this training, we're going to be taking questions. So Medora pointed out the Q&A box, which either would be open on your screen, or I think if you click on the bottom right hand corner of your screen where there's some little dots, you can click there, and if the Q&A box is not already open it there. As you have questions, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box. We're going to be watching those. Some of those we will interject with during that section where we're actually talking about that topic. And in other cases, we have breaks all along the way, which we're going to be then going to those questions and trying to make sure that we provide you answers for all of those. So if something's not clear to you, please go ahead and ask. In some cases, we're going to say to you, hey, we're going to cover that in more detail in just a little bit. All right, so let's jump into Module 1. and start on sort of the basic requirements on this. So we're going to talk a little bit about, some of you dealing with Section 3 is something new. I think it's always helpful to folks to kind of understand, where did this rule come from? What was the basis of this? So knowing a little bit about the history, oftentimes I think helps folks understand why was it written in this way? Why are they approaching it in this way? We'll be going through all of the programs that are covered on this, and then talk a little bit more about the purpose of the rule itself. So the genesis of this rule goes way back to my youth, which is probably before a lot of your time. But in 1967, there were 159 race riots across the country, and this was during President Johnson, LBJ's presidency. And so he appointed a commission to try to look into what were the causes of this. Why was there so much civil unrest? And then to come up with a list of recommendations. And so the Kerner Commission came back and essentially said, causes of the civil unrest are related to things like inadequate housing, high unemployment rates, inferior schools, wealth inadequacies, which unfortunately, 1967, fast forward to today, we're still dealing with a lot of those challenges. And so the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 was enacted, and it had the objective of providing where there were these investments of federal dollars to try to make sure that for employment opportunities and also for training opportunities, that they would go to as much as possible to lower income persons that were in that area where that investment was being made. And so we heard complaints that there's a big federally funded maybe housing development project that's happening. There are jobs being created, but nobody in that local community knows how to apply for a job. Nobody's really benefiting from that. And so that's sort of the history on Section 3. So since that point, in 2019, there was a proposed rule and of course a comment period about that. The comment period closed in June of 2019, and then the final rule was issued in September of 2019. They completed the review of the comments and finalized that rule. It hadn't been published at that point, and then started the internal clearance process, which is a long process going through HUD and OMB. And so that was finally published in September of 2020 with an effective date of November 30th, 2020. So you're going to hear us throughout this training when we talk about, when does this apply? That November 30th, 2020 date becomes really important. So that's when these new rules go into effect. Prior to that, you would have been under the old Part 135 rule, and we'll be talking more about that as we go forward. So it stepped into, the rules go into effect on November 30th, 2020, but then they also added this compliance date. So compliance and reporting on this new regulation begin on July 1st, 2021. And we'll be talking through the details of that. So of course, the key here is it's already in effect. And so we need to make sure that everybody is up to speed, that DLG is well positioned to be able to report and be in compliance, and that all of you know what your role is going to be on that. All right, so the purpose of this, as we mentioned, was to try to make sure when there were those opportunities related to federal investments for housing and community development programs, that to the greatest extent feasible, and I'll explain why that's there in a moment, that we're going to try to direct those benefits towards low and very low income persons, and particularly those that are recipients of the government assistance for housing. So particularly, like if we were talking about a public housing assistance, where they're reinvesting in a public housing development, we would be looking at the residents of that property as our first priority. And we'll be talking a little bit later about in our outreach efforts, which we did under the old Section 3 rule, where that focus is, where our priorities are for who we first are going to try to prioritize and sort of secondarily. We'll cover that a little bit later in this training. So, of course, this rule has impact on all of us. So, DLG, of course, is being held responsible for the funds they are receiving from HUD. So their written agreement with HUD includes compliance with these new rules. And of course, since you are receiving those funds and implementing programs and projects at the local level, you're going to be covered by the Section 3 rules. But then, of course, builders, nonprofits, other folks that are partners in the projects that we're undertaking, including contractors, subcontractors, are going to all be impacted by the new Section 3 rule. So, we all have to get up to speed. And frankly, we're going to be working over time to make sure that those other partners, like contractors, subcontractors, understand what's the new rule require, how does that impact what they're doing, what are you going to be expecting them to do and report back. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this training. So some sort of key changes to the new rule. You'll see the big change that we're going to be talking about is the fact that instead of under the old rule, where we really focused on hiring and we tracked new jobs that are created, the new final rule is looking at overall employment. So we're going to be looking at the overall labor force for a project and looking for workers, existing workers, and new hires that qualify as Section 3 and targeted Section 3 workers. So the concept is that it's going to promote sustainable employment. There's a benefit for that contractor to hire someone who is going to qualify to meet those Section 3 goals. And actually, we'll be talking about a little bit later that they're able to count or take credit for that employee for up to 5 years from the point that they hired them. And so their income could go up, their wages could go up, but if they qualified at the point that they were hired, and we'll go through the details of that. So this sustainable employment, it's not just focused on new hires that we dealt with in the past. And so, a lot of you would have said, well, in the past under Section 3, I had a lot of projects where there were no new hires, that the contractor came in with their crew. If they needed additional staffing, they brought in a subcontractor. And so this is a big change in this new final rule, and the idea behind it is that sustainable employment. And so with that, the metrics, the outcomes that we're going to be counting have changed quite a bit because they're now aligning with that sustainable employment. And you'll see as we go along that what has been done with the Section 3 rule is it's really been incorporated into normal programs. And so our reporting, our data collection is going to follow along with what you are already doing. So, in CDBG, you are already reporting who you assisted, who the beneficiary was. We were collecting information about, were they income eligible, all of that data. At the same time, we're going to be collecting information about those workers, so the employment on that, and reporting it through those same programmatic systems, as opposed to, it's a Section 3 separate reporting as part of that. And with this, also you'll see with the new rule that there's an attempt to help clarify. In some cases, we're going to be pointing out some changes that have been made, which are meant to streamline the process a little bit. And so stick with us because there's a lot of details to cover on this. So want to go through, and this is kind of an important point. I would think a lot of you immediately think, okay, so what all does this impact? Do I have to go back and change things? So the way this is stepped into, and you know, HUD for some of their programs, when they put out a new rule, it's different in that handoff between old rule versus new rule. So what they have done is they're looking at when those funds were committed. So when DLG is executing agreements and committing funds to you in a local community, if those commitments were made prior to November 30th, 2020, then those commitments were in place before this new rule came into place. So there's no change that needs to be made to those projects. We're going to refer to those as legacy projects. So they're going to still follow the old rule, 24 CFR Part 135, and you're simply going to maintain records in your files of all of your efforts under the old rule. HUD's not going to be collecting that information, so DLG is not needing to report that into HUD, but that would be part of ongoing, you know, compliance reviews by HUD. Presumably might be something that they would be looking at in the future. So that's projects, contracts that were executed prior to November 30th, 2020. So we then have, the new rule, we talked about the effective date being November 30th, 2020. So what we're calling our transition period are projects where those funds were committed on or after November 30th, 2020 through July 1st of 2021. So because those commitments were made once that new rule was in effect, those projects will need to follow the CFR Part 75, the new rule that we're going to be covering today. And again, would need to have records in place that would document all of your efforts, track compliance on this, but that information is not being collected and reported to HUD. In the past, that all was collected by DLG. They were required to report it into the SPEARS system. That will not be in effect for those. Now, programs are beginning to issue their individual notice. So the Office of Block Grant Assistance, CDBG, has issued a notice, CPD 2109, which provides some additional details about the reporting that the state's going to be required to do into IDIS. For disaster funding mitigation, those they would be reporting into DRGR. Those start for activities that started July 1st, 2021. But for CDBG, and at the end of this training, we're going to go into a lot of detail on this, so kind of hold questions on that. But essentially, we're going to be reporting to HUD at the end, at the completion of those projects. So, you know, much like you would be reporting, you know, your outcomes, recipients that were assisted, all of that at closeout, that's where DLG is going to be reporting back to HUD for that. Now we're going to talk about some interim reporting that DLG is going to collect to make sure that, you know, this is moving forward. But for CDBG itself, our reporting is going to be based on this CPD notice, and we'll go into great detail this afternoon on that. All right, so Andalyn, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And we did get two questions that came in the chat when you were talking. They're good questions, so I just wanted to go through them really quickly.
Yeah.
So look at executed grant agreement instead of preliminary approval then. And yes, I responded in the chat, but yes, that is correct. You'd look at the executed grant agreement to find out when those funds were officially committed. If a CDBG grant agreement was executed before November 30th, 2020, the old rules apply. Absolutely, that's 100% correct. Okay, we have a couple more questions that are coming in, so I'll just go with them real quick. The chat box, are we supposed to sign in and out of the same box in the Q&A? So you don't need to sign in to this training at all. I know that this counts as credit towards your certification, but your attendance was collected when you logged into the chat. So, and when you logged into the training. So you don't need to sign in of any box, the Q&A or the chat box. You are good to go if you're here, and thank you for joining us. If we have an ARC, this is the last one. If we have an ARC project that DLG is serving as the basic agent, do we go by the ARC grant agreement or the subsequent agreement with DLG?
That's an interesting question. Jennifer, do you want to help us think through this? So I want to make sure I understand the process on these agreements. So, well, first
Okay.
off, Jennifer, do we know has ARC, because is ARC considered a subset of CDBG? So does this automatically apply?
Okay, well, we have two different scenarios here. If it is just an ARC project only, 100% funded ARC, there are no CDBG in it, and DLG is acting as the state basic agency, we are not making them do Section 3 because it is not required through ARC.
Yep.
But if they have a combined, then it does apply because it has CDBG funds in it. So
Right.
we would go by the date of the CDBG award.
And we're going to be going through, I think, shortly on the applicability on that. So, you know, what funds trigger this and how you decide. So I think that's a good lead in for Andolyn.
Absolutely. So thank you all for those questions. Please keep them coming. And that is a great lead. And we're going to go straight into some covered programs here. So there are a number of programs that are covered by Section 3. I know that you guys are working with CDBG, so I won't go through all of these in detail, but they are here in your slides for you. You should know that if you were to ever do a project where CDBG funds were combined with public housing funds, then the public housing funds will have a slightly different set of rules. This public housing is one of the also covered under Section 3, and those funds will have a slightly different set of rules for applicability thresholds and for the reporting. So if you ever do a project with public housing funds, then know that your public housing agency will have slightly different rules than you will, and you'll need to work together on reporting information for that. All right, so now let's define a Section 3 project. A Section 3 project is a site or sites combined with any building or buildings and improvements located on the site or sites that are under common ownership, management, and financing. And this is where it's very important and nuanced. So under common ownership, management, and financing is the important one of the important parts there. Section 3 applies to projects that are fully or partially funded with HUD financial assistance and all public housing. If you work with a public housing project, then as soon as $1 of public housing funds goes in, then the Public Housing Authority is triggered to do Section 3. So projects that include state, local, private matching or leveraged funds that are combined with HUD funds are also covered under Section 3 if the amount of HUD funding for the project exceeds the thresholds. And we're going to go through the threshold in just a minute. So a Section 3 project is sites with any buildings or improvements located on the site or sites that are under common ownership, management, and financing. All right, so one of the key changes in the final rule is the introduction of the term Section 3 worker. There are three types of criteria under which someone could qualify as a Section 3 worker. So a Section 3 worker is any worker who currently fits or when hired within the past 5 years fit at least one of these categories. The Section 3 worker can be a low or very low income person, which means that the worker's income from the previous or annualized calendar year is below the income limit established by HUD, that 80% income limit. A Section 3 worker can be a person who's employed by a Section 3 business concern. We'll go into that in just a minute. A Section 3 worker can also be a youth build participant. So those are the three criteria under which you could certify someone as a Section 3 worker. Keep in mind that when you're calculating whether they're a very low or very low income individual, the residential address of the worker is used to determine those income limits. So you would utilize the income limits for the MSA in which the worker resides to identify income limits and determine eligibility. You also would use the individual income limits and not household income limits, which I know a lot of us are used to working with household income for like CDBG and home, but this is just the individual income. All right. There's another term that's coming up. So we've introduced a Section 3 worker. So now let's talk about a targeted Section 3 worker. A targeted Section 3 worker can be anyone who is employed by a Section 3 business concern, or any worker who currently fit or when hired fit at least one of these other criteria here on the screen. So a targeted Section 3 worker could be someone who's living within the service area or neighborhood of the project. And I'm going to explain what the service area is and how to get to the service area in just a moment. And a targeted Section 3 worker could also be someone who is a youth build participant. So someone could qualify as a Section 3 worker and a targeted Section 3 worker if they're employed by a Section 3 business concern or if they're a youth build participant. So you did hear that twice on both screens. And then targeted Section 3 worker could also be someone who is living within the service area or neighborhood of the project. So let's go straight into the service area and how you calculate that. So the service area, and that's defined in 24 CFR Part 75.5 for the new rule. The service area or neighborhood of the project is defined as an area within 1 mile of the Section 3 project. Or if fewer than 5,000 people live within 1 mile of the Section 3 project, then you just keep expanding the circumference, expanding the circle around the project until you get to 5,000 people, according to the census. So if fewer than 5,000 people live within 1 mile of a Section 3 project, then the service area or neighborhood of the project is within a circle centered on the Section 3 project that encompasses a population of 5,000 people, according to the most recent U.S. survey or census. So the image to the right here shows 3 concentric circles, with the inner circle showing a 1 mile radius around the project site. In this scenario, there's 1,000 people live within that 1 mile area radius. So you're going to extend the circle, and then we get the gray circle. And we've extended this to 25 miles, and we still only have 2,800 people living within that area. So we're going to extend it some more. And when you extend it to 50 miles, now you're capturing a population of 5,000 people. And so that 50-mile radius around the project site is going to be your service area or neighborhood of the project. Now, the HUD is working on a tool, I believe, that will help you figure out the neighborhood or service area of the project. But right now, the best thing that I can suggest is to use the NEPA Assist tool. So if you're familiar with doing environmental reviews, you might be familiar with NEPA Assist. If not, then it's fine. Just Google NEPA, N-E-P-A, and then space, and then assist, and it will come up with a website where you can put in an address, and you can ask for whatever radius you want around that address. And usually we use this for environmental reviews, for going through the 14 statutes and seeing what all is in that circle around the address. But if you go under at the top, there's more information button. Demographics is one of the drop down categories. So if you click on demographics, it will give you the population for that circle that you've requested according to the U.S. Census data. So that's a really good tool. The NEPAsys tool is a really good tool to use to define your service area for your project. All right, so we talked about Section 3 workers, and we've talked about targeted Section 3 workers. So now let me explain a little bit more, because you're going to need to use the Section 3 workers and the targeted Section 3 workers in a couple of very simple equations to figure out your labor hours. We're going to talk about all of that in just a minute, but let me explain that the graphic here shows 3 concentric circles again. So the largest external circle is your entire universe of workers, every worker that you have in your jurisdiction. The mid-sized circle shows all of the Section 3 workers, people who would qualify as Section 3 workers. And then the smallest innermost circle is your targeted Section 3 workers. So what this graphic is showing is that targeted Section 3 workers are workers, and they are also Section 3 workers. So when you're counting someone as a targeted Section 3 worker, you're going to count them as your targeted Section 3 worker, and that same person is also going to count as a Section 3 worker. So some Section 3 workers are targeted Section 3 workers as well. All right, so we just talked about Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers, and one thing that qualifies people as being Section 3 workers and as being targeted Section 3 workers is if they are employed by a Section 3 business concern. So what is a Section 3 business concern? A Section 3 business concern is a business that meets at least one of these criteria on the screen, and this has to have been documented within the last 6-month period from when you certify them as a Section 3 business concern. So a Section 3 business concern is at least 51% owned or controlled by low or very low income persons. A Section 3 business concern, over 75% of the labor hours performed for the business over the last 3-month period were performed by Section 3 workers. That could qualify a business as being a Section 3 business concern. Or if 51% or more, if this business is 51% or more owned and controlled by current residents of public housing or Section 8 assisted housing, then that could qualify a business as being a Section 3 business concern. And in that case, all of the workers would be qualified as Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers, which really helps towards meeting your goals. All right, so to qualify as a Section 3 worker, someone could be low or very low income, and that is defined in Section 3B2 of the Housing Act of 1937. That's determined annually by HUD. The limits are established at 80 and 50% of the area median individual income. I know I said this a little earlier, but the individual income, so not family or household income. It's only the individual threshold that's considered for determining low income eligibility under Section 3. Section 3 income limits are different from the income limits established for CDBG and home, and the effective date is different. These generally come out on April 1st. Okay.
And Angela, I'm just kind of popping up here. This is, I just wanted to make some emphasis on this. So this is one of the first examples that we're going to see of, I think, what has been intended as a way to streamline this process. So we're going to be talking later about, the specifics on qualifying workers, but because this is now limited to just that individual worker's income, in the past, if we were going to qualify that worker based on income, we would have had to collected, information about their family and being able to, put that in that context. So an employer couldn't have done that. But with this change, that means that the employer knows what rate of pay they are paying this person. And so we now have the option where the employer, looking at their own payroll, would be able to say, okay, out of the 30 workers that we have, these 10 workers qualify as Section 3 workers based on their individual income. And HUD has not said, you know, you need to go further and try to figure out, do they have other employment? You are simply certifying based on this hourly rate that they are being paid. And so you'll see as we go into the details a bit later on this, this is kind of an important difference than we've seen before. And I believe it was done to specifically try to make this simpler by allowing now that employers could actually handle this certification. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, but I want folks not to miss the significance of this. All right, sorry for interrupting, Andalyn.
Absolutely. Thank you, Les. That's a really big deal, and one of my favorite things about the new rule is that that though you have to figure out the Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers, it's something that could be done just using payroll. So, all right. Thank you so much, Les. Let's move forward now. Oh, and talk about Youth Build. I'm not sure if you guys have Youth Build in your area. Youth Build is an academic and occupational skills training program. It serves youth ages 16 to 24 who have dropped out of high school or previously dropped out and re-enrolled. Additional criteria for being a member of Youth Build include being a member of a low-income family, a youth in foster care or someone who's aging out of foster care, a youth or adult offender, a youth with a disability, a child of an incarcerated parent, or a migrant youth. Could be someone who is a participant in Youth Build, and someone who is a participant in Youth Build could be qualified as a targeted Section 3 worker. So just wanted to go through Youth Build. This is a program under the Department of Labor, and if you have it in your area, then might be a good partner for you there. All right, so now let's talk about applicability and thresholds a little bit. So for housing and community financial development of financial assistance for your CDBG, applicability includes projects that include housing rehab, housing construction, or other public construction. So note that demolition projects are covered by Section 3. That's a question that I got a lot when I worked for a entitlement community. Demolition projects are covered by Section 3. As well as so housing rehab, housing construction, and other public construction. That's things like infrastructure work, like extending water and sewage lines, sidewalk repairs, site prep, installing conduits for utility services. All of those are examples of other public construction work that would trigger Section 3. And for your CDBG, Section 3 requirements apply if a project exceeds $200,000 of housing and community development financial assistance from one or more HUD programs. So that's from CDBG, or if CDBG and there was some home in it, or if there was $100,000 of home and $100,000 of CDBG, then Section 3 would be triggered because it's about the amount of financial assistance coming from the Housing and Community Development Office at HUD. So keep in mind, applicable projects include housing rehab, housing construction, other public construction that exceeds $200,000 of housing and community development assistance. Okay, and this is on a project by project level. All right, so for lead, the threshold is met if the amount of Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes Assistance exceeds $100,000. So neither public housing financial assistance, if it's in the deal, or housing and community development assistance. So your CDBG dollars are not included in calculating whether lead assistance exceeds the $100,000 threshold. So if you have $100,000 of CDBG in a project and $100,000 of lead hazard control funds in the project, then the lead would be triggered because of Section 3, but your CDBG wouldn't necessarily be triggered because it's under the $200,000 threshold. Okay, and Section 3 does not apply to certain projects. Section 3 does not apply to material supply contracts. So these are contracts that don't require any labor. So for example, for an office or janitorial supplies would not be covered. Section 3 is encouraged, but not required there. Let me give you another example. A contract for windows, if someone were just buying and delivering, selling and delivering the windows, would not be covered. There's no labor there. But if that contract includes removal of the existing windows and installation of new windows, then the contract would be covered because of the involvement of labor there. Also, Indian and tribal preferences, Section 3 does not apply to those projects, contracts, subcontracts, grants, and subcontracts, subgrants subject to Section B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, or subject to tribal preference requirements, must provide preference in employment, training, and business opportunities to Native Americans and Indian organizations, therefore they're not subject to Section 3. For other housing and community development assistance and other federal assistance that doesn't trigger Section 3, please note that recipients are still encouraged to consider opportunities for supporting the purpose of Section 3, even though it's not necessarily required. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Les for a knowledge check.
All right. So I'm going to open up the polls here. Same sort of process as we did before. So our first question, this is going to be true or false. We have a Section 3, is this true or false? A Section 3 worker is any worker who currently fits or when hired within the past 5 years, one of the categories, and the categories are workers' income, is going to be within the individual income limits, workers employed by a Section 3 business concern, or worker as a youth build participant. True or false? Yay, so folks got this right. That's right off of the definition, and we will talk a little bit later looking at some sample forms, but also thinking about how would we collect that information. But those are our options. Any one of those definitions would mean that we had a worker that we could document as qualifying. All right, so our next question, a Section 3 worker is defined the same for projects that are funded with public housing financial assistance and HCD financial assistance. And I don't know that we've covered this in detail, but I think Andelin gave you sort of a warning about this earlier. So are the rules the same for our housing community development financial assistance, CDBG, and public housing financial assistance? All right, so it was probably an unfair question because I don't think we've really gone into that level of detail. But Andelin mentioned that if you ever had a project that was combined with public housing assistance, that the rules are different. And so what we have here is that the definition for a targeted Section 3 worker for public housing assistance is specific to public housing. So it's someone living in a public housing unit in that project that's being assisted, or secondarily then looking at residents that are receiving a Section 8 benefit. And so those definitions are different. And that's the only reason you need to know that would be if you in the future were to have a project that included public housing assistance in along with your CDBG, your home funds, ESG, any of those other funds, that you're going to be dealing with two different, subpart B of this rule applies for public housing assistance, and subpart C is what we're following and training you on for the housing community development assistance. So it makes things a little bit messy when you have two sets of rules on that. And so if that ever happens, you're going to need to go back to the regulation itself, look at those key differences, and this is one of the key differences, this targeted Section 3 definition. All right, I think that's probably more than enough on that topic. And so we've got another poll question here. And so this one again is true or false. And so our final question here is, a Section 3 business concern is a business that meets at least one of the following criteria documented within the last 6 months. So our options are at least 51% owned or controlled by a low or very low income person, or 75% of the labor hours performed by that business over the prior 3 months were performed by qualifying Section 3 workers. Or our third option is the business is at least 51% owned and controlled by current public housing residents or residents who receive Section 8 housing assistance. So is this true that this is the Section 3 business concern definition? Very good. So, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. I would think a lot of folks in looking at this are thinking, well, what's the likelihood of having a business that we are going to be contracting with that's going to be owned by a public housing resident, at least 51% owned and controlled, or that we've got an LMI person that is owning and controlling? Well, if your contractor that you're hiring for, let's say, a sewer plant construction, probably that prime contractor is not, but it could be that we've got subs that are being hired that are doing some aspect of this that might fit within that criteria. But then that third category, about 75% of the labor hours performed within the last 3-month period being performed by Section 3 qualified workers, particularly when we get into the subs. I think there is a possibility that we might have businesses that qualified based on the kind of work that was being done and the workforce that they employed. And the key here is that if we could actually qualify a business as a Section 3 business concern, we are able to then presume that all of their workers qualify not only as Section 3 workers, but also as targeted Section 3 workers. So that would very quickly help us get to meeting the benchmarks that we're going to be talking about for having labor hours that were completed by qualifying workers. And so it's why we are going to be spending a good amount of time talking about how might we identify a Section 3 qualifying business, because it could really streamline being able to meet the goals of this program. All right, so we're going to move into, we've got, I think, one slide to cover, one or two, and then we're going to move into our question and answer period. Oh, and actually we've got some poll questions on that too. All right, so the reason I put this in place, I think as most folks are kind of pondering, okay, what does this mean to me now that we have this new Section 3 rule in place? And Andalin's walked you through this criteria on when does it apply, what kind of funds are going to trigger this, what kind of projects are going to trigger. I think most communities are then going to be thinking about, okay, these are all the different activities that I've got going or I'm likely to do, and then thinking about, is Section 3 going to apply to this or not? So I came up with sort of a scenario of, for a local community, the types of projects that they had in place. So in this case, we've got a sewer extension project. We've got $288,500 in CDBG funding, and their award from Kentucky was on 5/22. We've got a water plant, $2 million that was committed in August of 2020. And then we've got a housing rehab program, $450,000 in CDBG funds. It was awarded in June of 21, and I've provided some details about, what their program limits are. So they've got a maximum limit for reconstruction at $225, and rehabs are limited at $75,000. So we've got a series of poll questions here related to these scenarios. So our first question: if CDBG is being used in a project for housing rehabilitation, then the Section 3 final rule does apply if the required threshold is met. True or false? So that's true, and let's kind of break this apart on how we actually apply that. So as Andelin mentioned, that threshold in has to exceed $200,000 for Section 3 to be triggered. And so if we're looking at a typical housing rehab program, and this is calculated on a project by project basis. So the program has $450,000, but the trigger is as we commit it for individual properties. So if our rehabilitations are limited to $75,000, they're never going to exceed that $200,000 threshold. So those individual units that are being rehabbed are not going to trigger Section 3 because they're below that threshold. We first have to apply it's CDBG funds, so we know CDBG is covered. Secondly, we know that our activities that trigger are housing rehabilitation, housing construction, and public construction. So this is housing rehab. It's an activity that triggers. Then we apply that threshold. So our individual rehabs, none of those are going to trigger Section 3. But because this community is doing reconstruction and they have a limit much higher because we're building a new unit of 225, we could have individual projects that would trigger Section 3 because of what their budget is going to be for that. So we really have to work through on this, particularly for housing, and determine whether it's going to apply or not. So, it should be good news that, oh, wait a minute, if I'm doing a down or not down payment assistance, if we did down payment assistance, it wouldn't be triggered because it's not housing construction or rehab. But in the case of a rehab program that we were funding individual, we had individual owners that applied, and we determined, yes, Mrs. Smith on Main Street, we're going to fund her, and Mr. Jones on West Elm, we're going to fund. We would be looking at each of those individual projects and applying that threshold separately, and so all of those would be exempt. So that just made your Section 3 compliance a bit easier on that. Hopefully that's not a disincentive to do reconstruction, but you could also think about, depending on what was a workable threshold, if you have said, okay, my maximum subsidy is going to be $200,000, if that was actually workable for you, that would mean that no reconstruction would trigger Section 3 because of that limit being in place. So that's how we're going to apply it for our housing programs. All right, our next poll question, same scenario, but a different question. So for the sewer extension project, is it going to trigger our new Section 3 rule? True or false? All right, so we got a little bit of a mixed response on this. So let's walk through this. So the answer is that yes, it is going to apply. So first off, we have to think about, well, when was this committed? In this case, it was committed on May of 22. So we know that the effective date for the new rule was commitments on November 30th, 2020 or later. So this project does fall under that new rule. Then we have to apply the thresholds on this. So it's a sewer extension project. That's going to be considered public construction. So all of our infrastructure, if we were building a public facility, those are going to be included in this public construction. And so that is an activity that Section 3 is triggered for. Then we have to apply the threshold test. Does it exceed $200,000? Yeah, we're at 288.5. And so this is a project that will have to follow the Section 3 requirements. So we're going to be tracking the total labor hours for that project and then tracking labor hours that were worked or completed by qualifying Section 3 workers and qualifying targeted Section 3 workers. So that does apply for this. And this is essentially that process you're going to have to do on a project by project basis. And I would presume that DLG will probably also do that, is making sure that you think about, okay, I've been funded for, a number of different things. Some of these things are going to trigger Section 3, and that's going to be part of your implementation regulatory requirements. And in other cases, you're going to be able to say, oh, this is a project or a type of activity that doesn't trigger Section 3. I don't have to worry about Section 3 on this particular one. All right, so we've got another question here. So now we're going to look at the water treatment project. Is it going to trigger the new Section 3 rules, the Part 75 requirements? Actually, our answer key is bad here. Clearly my error on our key. So let's have folks look at this, decide whether you think that it is applying or not. I'll give you a moment to do that, and then we'll walk you through the answer. All right, so what we're going to do here is apply first the question of when were the funds committed. And so in this case, the funds were committed in August of 2020. So because the funds were committed prior to the effective date of the new Section 3 rule, this project will not need to follow the new Part 75 rule, and it would follow the old rule. Now, mind you, you probably after November of 2020 are implementing this project. Construction is going on. You haven't completed that project and collected all the information, but you're not required to go back and change the rules that applied on this project because it was funded prior to the effective date of this rule. So for that water treatment plant, you're going to be following the old Part 135 rule. So in this case, you're going to be focusing on new jobs that are being created for this and reporting on that and the other rules that are part of the old rule, keeping that documentation in your files, but DLG is not going to be reporting that information into HUD's database on that. Now, HUD may come and monitor and look at this project, and they would then be looking at the old Section 3 rule and making sure that that project had complied with that. All right, so I hope that was an effective, my goal on this was to kind of help walk you through thinking about, okay, so when does this rule actually apply for the types of activities that I'm doing? And I'll just sort of elaborate a little bit. So when you think about that, if you were, let's say you were funding a public service activity, maybe you were, I don't know, funding a local domestic violence shelter or Meals on Wheels or something that qualified as a public service activity, because that's not housing construction, housing rehab, or public construction, Section 3 doesn't apply. If you were providing, let's say you applied for economic development assistance and you were going to provide funding to that for-profit business, and they're going to buy a piece of land, construct a new facility, that's not public construction. And so Section 3 would not apply. So there is this process of thinking about, is this activity covered by Section 3? And then also keeping in mind, when were those funds committed? Is this the old rule? Is this the new rule? Obviously, once we're past that transition period, we won't have to think about old rule versus new rule, but we are kind of coming into this live with the new rule and thinking about, okay, how many of my existing projects are going to be impacted by this? All right, so yes.
Excuse me, we did have a question that came in the chat, and it was regarding the sewer project that you just went over, so the sewer extension project. So if that sewer project was less than $200,000, Section 3 would not apply, correct? Even though the community had received more than $200,000 total in HUD funds, that project had received less than $200,000 in HUD funds.
Well, so in this case, what I've used is this is the CDBG award for that community for a water extension project. It's not a program, it's an individual project that's been funded. And so we would have to apply the $200,000 threshold on this, and it does trigger that. Now, I was trying to think, if you had, I don't know, if you had a, where you had failing septic systems and you were going to do a crush and fill and put in new on-site septic, those would be probably be project by project on this. But we really have to think about, much like we do with environmental review or other things, what is the project? And it's not just what I'm paying for with my CDBG funding, but it's what is the project? And in this case, for our calculation on that $200,000 threshold, as Andelin explained, it's looking at all HCD, housing community development funding. So, maybe this is a multifamily project where some CDBG funds are being used to do that sewer extension to this site where the housing is being constructed. And let's say in that case, we thought we could avoid Section 3 by putting in $190,000 in CDBG. But if there are home funds in that project, then we're looking at the cumulative amount of the $190,000 in CDBG funds and whatever home funds or ESG funds that are going into that. We could have some disaster mitigation funds. And so we look at that cumulative of the HCD funds, and if it exceeds 200,000, then that project will be covered by that.
Thank you so much.
All right. So I've got a list of some things from that, and then we'll see if there are other questions that come in on this. So there was a question about with multiple sites under one contract, how are we looking at that service area? How are we defining that? So this is a great question. This is one of the first questions that as we were beginning to look at the HUD training materials that we had to ask, and we went back to HUD on this. So HUD's response on this was, so let's use the scenario of I've got a scattered site project where let's say I'm doing rehab as a single project of 5 units that are scattered around in a community. And so when we talk about, well, how do we determine this service area? Because it's not at one site, how do we deal with that? So HUD's response was we would apply this, is it within 1 mile of any of those 5 sites? Then we would say that that worker does qualify as being within that service area. Now, unfortunately, I think in looking at this, it gets a little more complicated when you're working in a rural area, that you may already be extending that service area to get to a population of more than at least 5,000. And so you're going to have to make those same adjustments on applying. So in the case that Andelin showed earlier, I think went to a 5-mile range to get to the appropriate population number, then you would use that same sort of range to determine on that. So we are hoping, we've been told on the HUD tool that Andelin mentioned that it was being developed. We were told quite a while ago that it was in beta testing, which would mean that it was sort of at the end of the development process and hopefully would be released soon. My understanding of what I was told about that was that not only could you then use that to determine, okay, how big does my service area need to be in this non-urban area to have the 5,000 in population, but my understanding was that you could also use that with a worker's address to then plug in that address and determine, yes, they reside within this service area, we can count them, or no, they do not. So I'm hopeful that with the release of that tool, that would make this easier for it. And I would think as a state program with a lot happening in more rural areas, that this defining that service area is going to be a key part up front of then determining, okay, how are we going to determine who actually qualifies, who we're going to count, and who we will not count. So that's going to be an important factor. There also, I made a note, and I think we've covered this in the knowledge check, but this key point about this difference between project and program, and keeping in mind the example of housing rehab, that if we had a single unit as the project where we have, someone applies and we find them eligible and then we commit funds to provide assistance, that is the project level. And so we're going to look at the amount of funds that are going in there and determining whether it exceeds that $200,000 threshold. But for instance, in that scattered site project where we talked about, we'd have one owner that applies and they are funded to maybe rehab and then rent or sell affordable units. So we've now got 4 units instead of 1. Then we easily could be beyond that $200,000 threshold. So we are going to have to determine, what's my project? Are there any other HCD funds in this project to be able to determine does Section 3 apply or does it not apply? I also had made a note about public construction, and I think we probably in the knowledge check also kind of covered that in thinking about what is public construction. And as Andelin mentioned, it's all of your infrastructure projects, which a lot of the Kentucky CDBG funds are used for that, big need for that. I think state programs, that's always a gigantic part of how funds are being used. But then I use the example of economic development where we are doing construction, but it's not public, it's private at that point. And so that does not fit that category. And I think we've also talked adequately about HCD funding. Oh, there was a question about HCD funding versus all. Let me change. I have a setting here that kind of sorts questions. The question was only HUD funds or all federal funds? So it's actually even narrower than just HUD funds. It's housing community development funds are what we're going to be counting. So on a much earlier slide at the beginning of Andolin's section, so I think that is slide 17. No. Here we go. So we had a slide that was showing the HCD funding. Oh, and it changed on my, but.
I'm sorry, I'm moving it. Do you?
Okay. So I think it's the slide before that. Yep. So these are our HCD funds that you could have combined with this to apply that threshold. If you had a project that included public housing assistance, they are unlucky in that they don't have this threshold. So any dollars in coming out of their capital fund, their operating fund, RAD in some cases are going to trigger. But so for the most part, I would think you're going to be looking at all CDBG funds, all disaster funds that might be included in that. I don't know if you guys are still receiving NSP funds, maybe program income that's being recommitted, and maybe you're using that in conjunction with CDBG funds. Also our home funds, and then the trust fund dollars would be part of that. So, you're always going to have to look at what's my overall project, what are all those sources and uses, and then look to this list if we've got a mix of other funds to determine, oh, I've got something else in the mix, and then include that when we're looking at that $200,000 threshold for that. Let's see, do we have other questions? Looks like I think we've handled most everything here. All right. I'm going to suggest we go ahead and keep moving. We do have another question and answer session a little further along, so we'll have an opportunity to look at that. And so we're going to have fun doing some math. It's always good to have some math. So we're going to be introducing this concept of safe harbor. And so safe harbor is what we're using for a term of when you're in compliance. And let me just open this up. And Andolin, I think this is mine, but is it yours?
I can cover it if you'd like. I thought it was mine, but up to you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, all right.
I just don't have a note here.
Yeah, so safe harbor, what does it mean to be in safe harbor? Safe harbor creates the presumption that you as the recipient have met Section 3 requirements, absent any evidence to the contrary. So I talked a little bit earlier about there's going to be a little formula that you're going to have to do. This is what we're talking about here. Safe harbor and meeting or exceeding safe harbor benchmarks. I'm going to get to the benchmarks in just a minute. But there are two things that you have to do. You have to meet and exceed safe harbor benchmarks and follow the required prioritization of effort. Okay, so if you do all of these things and you still have not met the benchmark and you've shown that you followed required prioritization of effort, then what happens? Um, if it's very hard, if you just tried everything you could, but you could not meet safe harbor and meet those benchmarks, then you can provide evidence that you made a number of qualitative efforts to assist low income and very low income persons with employment and training opportunities, and that then you'll be considered in compliance with Section 3, absent evidence to the contrary. I keep saying that. Evidence to the contrary includes evidence of findings obtained from a Section 3 compliance review that maybe these things did not happen. So that's kind of worst case scenario. All right, so now let's go into all of these things that we just mentioned. What's safe harbor benchmarks? What's prioritization of effort? And some examples of qualitative efforts here. So in order to meet your safe harbor benchmarks, you're going to have to be reporting on labor hours. So a labor hour is different if public housing funds were involved versus if housing community development funds were involved. So the first top icon there applies to public housing financial assistance. They're reporting on a fiscal year basis. That does not apply to you. For housing community development assistance like CDBG, you're going to be reporting labor hours as hours worked by all workers employed on a particular Section 3 project. So this is a project by project basis. You'll be reporting this in IDIS. It's a question that you might have noticed comes up on the front page now when you're creating a project in IDIS, or an activity rather in IDIS, and something that you'll have to answer the questions in order to get that pathway is complete in IDIS in order to close out that activity. Okay, so the benchmarks. You're going to be reporting on labor hours. There are two formulas that you're going to need to do in order to meet these particular benchmarks, and these are called the 25-5 benchmarks. So 25% or more of all labor hours, total labor hours worked on a project, must be worked by Section 3 workers. And 5% or more of all labor hours, total labor hours, must be worked by targeted Section 3 workers. Okay, so that's two formulas, and you have to have both of them correct, both of them over the thresholds of 25% and 5% in order to be in compliance and having met your Section 3 benchmarks. So again, total labor hours, 25% or more of total labor hours must be worked by Section 3 workers. So you're going to take total labor hours and divide that by Section 3 labor hours, or take Section 3 labor hours and as the numerator and total labor hours as the denominator. And then for your targeted Section 3 hours, labor hours, same format, same formula. Targeted Section 3 hours as your numerator, total labor hours as your denominator, and you have to get 25% for Section 3 labor hours worked and 5% for targeted Section 3 labor hours worked. Those are your new Section 3 benchmarks. All right, so we talked about labor hours and how to calculate Section 3 labor hours and targeted Section 3 labor hours, but there's one more special category called professional services labor hour. So professional services or non-construction services that require an advanced degree or professional licensing. Those are actually excluded from Section 3. And the reason is because HUD wants to ensure that this final rule emphasizes the requirement to prioritize low and very low income workers. They did so by providing this category of exempted workers given the challenge to hire low and very low income workers in jobs that require degrees and licensing. So it makes it a little bit easier on you for some of those jobs that that do require degrees and licensing. It's going to be super hard to find lower and very low income workers. So we're taking those professional services out of the equation. So these non-construction services may include things like legal services, financial consulting, accounting services, environmental review assessment services, architects, and civil engineering services. So those folks you would take out of the equation. It's going to make meeting the benchmarks a little bit easier. So the final rule does give credit and reporting for opportunities that are created in the professional services context. So a recipient can count any work performed by these professional services categories, Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers as Section 3 and targeted Section 3 labor hours. So you can put them in the numerator of the calculation. And you don't have to necessarily count them in the denominator of the calculation. So if you find that someone, let's say you did your calculations and you did not meet your Section 3 benchmark. So you go back and say, I just want to double check one more time. I'm going to pull everybody that was on the project, even people who did these professional services. And you find that a number of them actually did qualify as low and very low income. So you didn't have to report them, but to give a little boost, you could report them and you could put them in only the numerator of that equation, the equations that we just talked about, and not put them in the denominator. And in that way, it's going to give you an even bigger bump towards meeting the Section 3 benchmarks. So I hope that that is helpful. All things that HUD kind of folded in there to make this process a little bit more workable for you. All right, so there may be some updates to safe harbor provisions and benchmarks. With the old Section 3 rule, it didn't really move or update. It was what it was for a very, very long time. With the new Section 3 rule, HUD will update the benchmarks through the Federal Register. Those are subject to public comments, but this will happen no less than once every 3 years. So no less than once every 3 years, HUD will assess what's going on here, how the reporting is going, how successful it's going, if there need to be changes, and they may change the benchmarks. These benchmarks may be changed nationwide, or they may be changed on a geographic basis, on a basis of the nature of the Section 3 project, or according to other variables. So please know that not less once than every 3 years, these are subject to change and update and hopefully get better and better. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Les.
All righty, thank you. So this is where we get to kind of apply some of this, and I hope this will kind of help make this a little bit clearer for folks. So we're gonna, and these are kind of walking through examples much in the way that you would if you were dealing with a real life project and needing to think about, apply these rules and think about what was going to apply. And let me just pull up a note here. So in this scenario, we've got the city using CDBG funds, and it's $207,000. So unfortunately, just over that threshold to install a water line for an unserved LMI neighborhood that has contaminated wells. So in this case, we have hired a local company, Shelley Construction, and you'll see we've gotten, you're provided some information about that company. So we're told that it is 41% ownership by an individual living in Section 8 housing. And we're also told that 50% of the labor hours for that business over the last 3 months were performed by workers that qualified as Section 3 workers. And so in this case, we have to try to apply the rules that we've been looking at. So the reason we're looking at information about the business itself is to try to determine, so do they actually qualify as a Section 3 business concern? Because if they did, we could then automatically count all of their workers' labor hours on this. So unfortunately, we know that there are 3 options on this. 2 of them have to do with the ownership having to be at least 51% owned and controlled by someone living in Section 8 housing or in public housing unit, or being LMI. So we've got 41% ownership that doesn't qualify. Our other option to be able to qualify that business as a Section 3 business concern would be if we looked at the last 3 months overall for that company, and they had at least 75% of their worker hours were performed by Section 3 qualifying workers. In this case, it's 50%, so that doesn't meet that threshold. So that simply means that we can't do this sort of streamlined, this is going to be easy, that this is a Section 3 business concern and I can just count all their hours. It means we have to do the math on this. So in this case, we know that we have to look at what are the total labor hours for the project. And so that's that 2,000 hours, which is the overall project. That's how we're depicting it in this graphic. Of that, we know that 520 hours were actually completed by workers that qualified as Section 3 workers. And then, of course, we also need to collect information about targeted Section 3 workers. And so out of that 520 hours that were qualified Section 3 workers, some of those workers, based on where they reside, were within that service area, and so we could also count their hours, not just as Section 3 labor hours, but also as targeted Section 3 labor hours. So we're going to count that worker in both categories. They qualify and their hours are counted as Section 3 workers, but we're also going to count them because they also qualify based on residence as targeted Section 3 workers. So we're also going to count the 200 hours that they worked for that. So with that, having collected that information, we're then going to do our math. So we're dividing our 520 labor hours into our total labor hours of 2,000. So that puts us at 26%, which is really great news because that means that we have met that 25% benchmark that we have in place for our Section 3 workers. And then our second calculation on this then is looking at targeted Section 3 workers. And in this case, we've got 200 hours divided into 2,000. So we're at 10%. And our goal, or our benchmark here for targeted Section 3 workers was 5%. So in this case, this project is going to be able to report, you're going to report this information to DLG, they're going to report it to HUD, they're going to plug in these hours, and we'll look at how that happens later this afternoon. But this project has met those benchmarks, the 25 and 5%, and so we're good to go on that. And that's kind of the goal here. That's what we're working towards. It's not always going to happen for all of our projects. So the second part of what has to be reported to HUD is this prioritization of effort. And so here again, we see this language about to the greatest extent feasible. Your goal is that on doing our outreach on employment and training, that first we're going to do outreach to our Section 3 workers who live within that service area. We talked about it could be 1 mile, it might be expanded to be able to have that 5,000 in population. So that's our first prioritization of effort on all of our outreach that we would be doing. And then secondarily, trying to encourage participants in youth build programs to also participate in our program. Now, the reason we use this to the greatest extent feasible language is that we always have to be consistent with federal, state, and local laws and regulations. So that's going to apply when we talk later about the procurement process. You're having to follow the state procurement requirements, but also in some areas there, we've talked to folks around the country who in some of those communities, there were specific rules about how they could do outreach to the public and who could be targeted as part of that. And so this Section 3 doesn't allow you to ignore any of those other regulations that would apply. So we're going to be talking about these outreach efforts, which Section 3 is calling qualitative efforts. So this is our prioritization of effort for when we have employment and training opportunities. And then secondarily, where there are contracting opportunities. So we're trying to get Section 3 business concerns to participate. Then our first priority would be trying to identify Section 3 business concerns that would provide economic opportunities to potential workers residing in that service area. And then secondarily, we would look to our youth build programs. And so when we get this afternoon into the reporting, each project would need to say, yes, I followed this prioritization of effort, and here are my numbers on total labor hours, Section 3 labor hours, and targeted. And if we're meeting those benchmarks and have followed this prioritization of effort, that project is considered, based on the benchmarks, to have met that safe harbor to be in compliance. We're also going to be talking at more length this afternoon about the fact that, for those projects that don't actually hit the benchmarks, we can still be in safe harbor based on those qualitative efforts that we're going to do. So those qualitative efforts are really important, that every community implement those so that we're ensured that even if we don't meet the benchmarks, that we are still going to be able to report that we're in compliance, because we have had sort of that secondary, our qualitative efforts, our backup plan for compliance on that. All right, so Andelin, there were a couple questions that I had looked at that I'll answer. Then I kind of was seeing questions flying through there, so I think we can hit some of those. I did want to use the example Jennifer had suggested that, we're going to have some projects that are a combination of CDBG and rural development. And so I'm going to suggest we kind of think in terms of, let's say we have maybe a water line development project that is both RD and CDBG. The way we're going to apply this test on does CDBG apply is, again, we're going to first look to see when was it committed? So is it old rule? Is it new rule? So what are we going to apply there? And then looking to see that if we have one of the triggering activities, which a water line is going to be considered public construction. So then we have to look at our threshold. And so our RD funds are not on our list of housing community development funds. So unless we have some other HCD funds, we're then simply going to focus on the CDBG total funds and determine, do those funds exceed $200,000? If they happen to be $200,000 or less, then that project is not going to trigger Section 3. If, let's say, our CDBG funds are $300,000, then this is a project that has triggered our Section 3 requirements. And so when we look to report our total labor hours, we're looking at all the labor hours that were worked for this project, not just the labor hours that we paid for with CDBG funds. We're looking at that total project. And from that, then we need to collect how many of those labor hours qualified as Section 3, how many qualified as targeted, and we're going to be collecting and reporting that information. So it's really looking at that overall project, much like we would do with environmental review, not just what we are paying for with the CDBG funds specifically. There also was a question about, and let me try to scroll down to this, that if we had a neighborhood redevelopment program, I think I'm almost there. Yeah, here we go.
If you have, if you have a $1 million, go ahead.
Yeah, if we have a $1 million CDBG grant for a neighborhood redevelopment project and an owner is being relocated and they're using their relocation payment to build a $175,000 house, does Section 3 apply? So let's kind of take this apart a little bit. So our CDBG funds for this redevelopment project, and I presume that that's going to include housing rehabilitation. And so this is an activity that is going to trigger Section 3. We've got $1 million, so we're way over that threshold. So the project itself, the redevelopment project, is going to be a Section 3 project. Now, in the case of the relocation, and I don't know that I've seen any FAQs come through on this in dealing with HUD on this, but as I look at this, what we're providing to that owner is a relocation payment. They, with that payment, are then choosing what they're going to do with that, and they, in that case, are going to choose to contract to have a house built for them. So that is not a direct public construction on this. And so I don't believe that those payments, much like if we had a down payment assistance program that we were providing funding for, because we are not rehabbing or constructing a unit with the funds, we're simply providing a direct benefit to that individual. We would not be looking at that payment to see what they used it for and then determining whether the Section 3 would apply. And so that's not going to be part of your trigger for Section 3, but your $1 million program itself and what you're doing with those funds directly would be triggering on that. And there was a question about the breakdown on this, and just want to make sure folks know it's 25 and 5%. And so some of you are going to have to unlearn the percentages that you were looking at under the old rule. Also in the past where you were thinking about what's the contract dollar amount, what's the subcontract dollar amount. Our test really here is looking at the project and using the sort of criteria that we've been going through about, is it a CDBG funded activity or HCD funded activity that is triggering for this based on housing construction, housing rehab, or public construction, and then looking at that dollar threshold to determine whether that particular project is going to trigger or not. So you're really going to need to complete that process on a case-by-case basis to then determine whether that will trigger. There also is a question, and I think what, so there was a question that said, so a total of 30%, or is it is the 5% part of the 25%? So what's important to understand is there are two separate calculations on Section 3 workers and targeted Section 3 workers. And we're always going to have, for our targeted Section 3 workers, they're also going to qualify. We're also going to count their labor hours towards our Section 3 calculation, but only some Section 3 workers will also qualify as a targeted worker, and that's going to be based on their residence, or it could be that they were a youth build participant. And so they are two separate calculations, but it's not double counting. So let's say I am a worker for that contractor. I qualify based on income as a Section 3 worker. If I worked 100 hours on that project, we're going to count all of my hours towards the Section 3 benchmark on that. Then I would have to determine, do I also qualify as a targeted Section 3 worker? So I'm going to look at my address and determine, am I within that service area? I also could be looking to see, am I a was I hired from the youth build program, and can I be certified in that way, and so be able to be counted? So it's not double counting that my 100 hours that were counted towards my Section 3 cumulative total. If I also happen to qualify based on, let's say, where I live, we're also going to use my 100 hours, and they're going to go towards that targeted Section 3 benchmark also. So it's not double counting. I'm counting all the hours that qualify for each of those categories. Andelin, do we have other questions that you got ready to? Cool.
Yeah, we have a really great question. So if we have an employee of a contractor on a CDBG project that needs to comply with Section 3, and they were hired within the last 5 years, we need to look at what income was before being hired by the contractor. How do we get that info? Additionally, if the employee had been employed by this contractor for longer than 5 years, we just need to look at what their current income is under the current employer and other employers if they work more than one job. That's a really, really great question, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think that this is going to be discussed a little bit more in the afternoon, but let me go through it a little bit now too. So, so if there's an employee of a contractor, first of all, I believe that there's many situations where the employee doesn't have to get involved or even know that they're being counted as a Section 3 worker or targeted Section 3 worker. The contractor will be doing all of this gathering information based on their payroll and doesn't really need to even include the worker in this. So that's one point, and I think that's important. So we only look back as far as the worker has been employed with that employer. So you're never going to ask for information about before they were employed by that employer. There's a 5-year look back period where you can, if someone was low income, let's say they were hired in let's say they were hired in January of 2021. And they were low to moderate income at that time. And now we're about to let our contract, we're trying to certify them as a Section 3 or targeted Section 3 worker. They're no longer low to moderate income. They've gotten raises, and that is wonderful. And that is the purpose of Section 3 right there. So what we're looking at is HUD is allowing for a 5-year look back period that you could certify them from January of 2021, from the day that they were hired forward 5 years. So from January of 2021 through January of 2026, they would qualify as a Section 3 worker or targeted Section 3 worker based on having been low income at that one point in time. And the hope is that they're not low to moderate income after that, and they just keep making more and more money and everything is good. Okay, so additionally, and this was something that really excited me. If that person has multiple jobs, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's not based on household income. It's based on individual income and what their income would be from that contractor if it were annualized and on a full-time basis. So you don't have to worry about any other jobs. That contractor can simply look at his payroll only. Okay, so I've said that if they were hired in January of 2021 and all of that, let's say you're trying to certify somebody now, and you want to look back at January of 2020 because that's when they were hired. You can only go back to November 30th of 2020 because that's when the rule took effect. So for right now, we're in 2022. Unfortunately, we can't go back 5 years right now because we can only go back as far as the rule was in effect, November 30th, 2020. As of November 31st, 2025, we'll have that 5-year space to be able to look back the full 5 years. But right now, we can only look back to November 30th, 2020. I hope that was helpful. Les?
So I think it was very helpful. And so I think in that case, let's use that sort of scenario. So if I was an employer and I was trying to figure out who might qualify, I could look at current salary, and I may have some folks who, based on what I'm currently paying them, they would qualify. So maybe I've got 100 workers. I've got 5 that based on their current salary, they qualify. Okay, so I've got 5 workers, but I also have that ability to look back. And in this case, right now, we could only look to November 30th of 2020. So if I have someone who was hired from November 30th, 2020 onward, I could look at what they were paid when they were initially hired. And so maybe I then find that, okay, I've got actually 10 more workers that they qualify because when I first hired them, I started them out at some lower wage. I still can count them because I'm within this 5-year period from when they were hired. So now maybe I have 15 workers cumulative. And so for this project, I can count all of their hours as a Section 3 worker. Now, the thing that's a little unfortunate here, and I actually had this whole conversation with HUD about this, was, we're used to, under economic development, being able to look at what was the person's salary before they were hired for this job. And so we could have somebody who maybe their starting salary, they wouldn't be LMI, but when they applied, they were LMI. That's not how it works for Section 3. We are looking at what their actual salary is from this employer. And so, we have folks around the country who said, well, these are predominantly union positions. We have wage rates that are automatically going to put workers, they're not going to qualify as low income. And we're looking at their individual wage as opposed to saying, okay, well, the good news is this person has 10 children. And so, we could look at that income for a household of, many, but it's looking at that individual salary. So the good news on that is that, as Andolyn was mentioning, and we'll talk more this afternoon, that ability for an employer to kind of simply be able to look at payroll, be able to determine who qualifies based on their wage, ask that next question about when were folks hired and did they qualify when they were hired, and is it within our time period, this 5-year look back that right now is limited to the November 30th, 2020. It really allows that employer to be able to do all of that, determining who in their workforce qualifies, and then how many hours did they work based on their payroll records for this project, and be able to report that directly from the employer without going to every single employee asking them to sign a self-certification, which is an option, but it kind of streamlines things a little bit.
Right, we're almost at time. We have a follow-up question. What if they were hired prior to November 30th, 2020, but as of November 30th, 2020, they were LMI and are not now? Can we count them?
My understanding is the look back is to the hiring date. And so I don't believe that we can, even though on November 30th, 2020, their income qualified, I think we go back to the date of hire. Andolyn, I think we can double check that, but my understanding is that it is the hiring date.
Yeah, I think we can double check that because my understanding was that you could go back as far as the look back period was. So you could look back to whatever it was, November 31st, 2020 was what I thought. So
we'll double check that because obviously that would help you to be able to do that. All right, so that brings us to the end of our time. We're going to be back again at 2 and going through the rest of the material. We will have more question and answer periods, and we may even be able to get an answer to this last question in the meantime. So get some food, relax a little bit, and we'll see you back in just a little bit. Thanks, everybody.